Welcome to Swimming in Front of the Gray Swans, the fourth and final live session at Exemplar Global's Online Auditor Expo. I'm your host, Mike Richmond. These live sessions look at relevant topical issues within auditing and allow you, our viewer, to interact directly with our subject matter experts in real time. In this presentation, we're going to be considering what auditors of management system standards need to understand about risk-based thinking, risk mitigation, and risk avoidance, especially for foreseeable risks. Those are the so-called gray swans in the title, the gray swan events that are neither very common nor exceedingly rare. And these are exactly the types of risks that auditees need to account for as part of the risk-based thinking language found in ISO standards. To address this important topic, we're being joined today by a pair of authorities on risk, Greg Hutchins and Tom Taormina. But before I introduce you to Greg and Tom, let's quickly set the ground rules for today's session. As part of this presentation, you're going to have the opportunity to ask questions of our panelists at any time. And to do so, simply send them to us using the discussion form box that's right there on your screen, and we'll get them over to Tom and Greg. Also note that the session is being recorded and is going to be made available on demand throughout the rest of the Online Auditor Expo, which ends on July 31st. So if you are watching this recorded version and you want to ask a question of Tom or Greg, you can do so. Just email them to us at emma@exemplarglobal.org. That's EMMA@exemplarglobal.org. So without further ado, let's get to our panelists. Greg Hutchins is the founder of Certified Enterprise Risk Manager, CERM Academy. His company was among the first companies in 1987 to provide audit training with one of the first ISO 9001 certification bodies in North America, AGA Labs. In addition, they were the first to be approved by the Department of Homeland Security for critical infrastructure protection, forensics, assurance, analytics. CERM Academy had been successfully conducting risk audits for more than 20 years. Greg is the author of Value-Added Auditing, Risk-Based Auditing, Supply Chain Risk Management, ISO 31000:2018, Enterprise Risk Management, and Working It, Disruption Rules. Tom Taormina is a subject matter expert on the ISO 9000 series of standards, who has written 10 books on the beneficial use of the standards. He was one of the first quality control engineers at NASA's Mission Control Center during projects Gemini and Apollo. As a business consultant, Tom conducts risk assessments for companies from startups to global brand leaders. As a consulting and testifying expert in products liability and organizational negligence, he conducts formal assessments of defendant companies to determine if they exhibited an appropriate standard of care in product introductions. His trademark methodology, forensic business pathology, is an accepted credential by trial attorneys and judges. So to start us off, Greg and Tom are going to, in turn, are going to tell us a little bit about risk and the auditing function. So we're going to start with you, Greg. Take it away.
Hey, Mike. Thanks a lot for having me. I'd also like to thank Exemplar Global for the opportunity. So a little background. Mike asked me to sort of talk about risk-based auditing, what is risk, and discuss risk-based thinking. So let's dive into it. ISO added RBT, risk-based thinking, in 2015. It basically was what I would think a sort of a dramatic change in the way ISO, and specifically 176, looked at the standards. Again, I go back to the 1987 standards where we had 20 systems. A company would develop procedures, an auditor would check those procedures for compliance, and essentially the company would get registered. Now we've got a whole new standard, a requirement called risk-based thinking. Now, in terms of auditing, we really have three parties. We have the what is the auditor looking at? And that's normally defined in ISO 9001, 14001. We have the how will the auditor conduct the audit, which is 19,011, 2018. And then we have you, the auditor. And we're going to discuss all three in today's session. Now let's talk about the new requirements, the how. The original standard for conducting the audit actually was developed in 1990. It was at that time called ISO 10011. It was 7 pages. The new standard, 19,011, 2018, is 47 pages. And that requires new requirements from you, the auditor. One of the things that I really like about the new standard, 19,011-2018, is that it's really a very comprehensive standard. I think it's the best ISO standard I've seen because it defines how are you going to plan, conduct, and report the audit. And it was also a genius move. Why? Because all you have to do today is look at COVID, which is a risk event, and look at global warming, which is really a systemic worldwide risk issue. And that's where everybody's now talking about risk. And one of the things that we believe in is that the filter for all management and even quality auditing decision-making is going to be done through the lens of risk. So now let's look at ISO's risk journey. Mike, can we look at the new slide? Okay. So ISO 19011 really promotes risk-based auditing in all ISO management systems. But let's look at the two challenges that you, the quality auditor, now face, and let's offer some solutions. What we're going to discuss over the next 4 slides are, first, what is the definition of risk? And then we're going to talk about what does risk-based thinking, RBT, really mean, and how can you operationalize it? Next slide, Mike, please. So here's the definition of risk as defined by ISO 31000. ISO 31000 is the risk management guideline for all ISO standards. And it basically defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. Now, what does that mean? Uncertainty on objectives. How do you operationalize that? How do you audit against that? Well, here's the challenge. It's very difficult. We redefine 31,000 definition in terms of the effect of uncertainty on the achievement, on the attainment of objectives. It changes everything around. So next time you conduct an ISO audit or a 14,000 audit, think in terms of achieving the objective. So let's look at RBT. Here's the challenge from you, the auditor. How do you basically audit somebody's thinking? The reality is you really can't audit somebody's thinking unless maybe you passed Mind Reading 101 or some similar course. Here's the challenges. You can't audit somebody's thinking. There's no evidence in mind reading. There's no mental audit trail or process, and there are no mental artifacts. And these are the 3 things you need. You need to have an audit trail. You need to have audit artifacts, and you have to have some way for an independent third party, you, the auditor, to reach the same decision as the people who are implementing ISO systems. So what we need to do is reframe and redefine RBT, and this is how we do it. Next slide, please. RBT, in terms of what we suggest, is look in terms of risk-based problem solving and risk-based decision-making. In both cases, you have an audit trail on how somebody solved a problem, an audit trail in terms of how somebody made a decision. The second thing is there should be artifacts. There should be something that you, the auditor, the quality risk auditor, can look at to make a determination. A determination in terms of, can that organization meet the QMS objective? Can the organization, you, the auditor, look at the organization and ensure that there was an audit trail for their decision-making? If you take risk-based thinking and you operationalize it in terms of those 2 criteria, risk-based problem solving, risk-based decision-making, you are basically 90% there in terms of doing a risk-based audit. Now, a couple of reasons why we suggest it is, or suggest using an RBPS and RBDM process, is that the process for auditing outcomes exists. The process for actually looking at an objective and evaluating the risks that are being mitigated can be evaluated. Artifacts are evaluated, and the inputs and assumptions for risk-based problem solving and risk-based decision making are available. And then finally, you, the third party, the auditor, can reach the same conclusion as your auditee did. So I think that's about it. Is there another slide, Michael? So why should you care? Michael asked me this question, and this is a question that I had to address to IRCA and to CQI in the UK a couple months ago. On the left side, you can see that the average salary of a quality assurance auditor is about £29,000. On the other hand, on the right side, you can see that the average salary for an internal, or what we would call a risk-based auditor, is almost twice as much, £51,000. Risk-based auditing not only is a requirement for you, the quality auditors, and forget that, you're no longer quality auditors. You're going to evolve into risk auditors. And if you do that, your salary is going to basically double. As you can see, the salaries for quality auditors are on the left side. The risk auditors, the salaries are on the right side. And as a risk auditor, you're going to be making almost twice as much. So that's about it, Michael.
Well, thank you, Greg. Great presentation. I'm going to turn it over to Tom now and let him tell us a little bit more about risk as well. So take it away, Tom.
Thanks, Greg and Mike. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are and what time zone you're in. And thanks for being part of Exemplar Global's quality auditing, quality expo course this year. We're gonna build on what Greg said, and it'll evolve as I go through the presentation. But my latest book is Foreseeable Risk, and it was written for lawyers and implementers. So if you want a reference text, that's a pretty good one. Next. What I've discovered over my 50+ year career is that you can do a very good metaphor of business as being complex organisms in continual motion. I've had the privilege of working with more than 700 companies. And if you look at them as a living organism, you're going to get a better feel for what's really going on. Next. Each organization also has a DNA that starts at the concept of the company and ends at the sunset of the company or sale, whichever is most. So as auditors, we have got to understand the DNA of the organization we're auditing. Next. So I go back to the dictionary when I'm exposed to new terms. So the dictionary says risk is exposure to danger, harm, or loss. Greg discussed what traditional risk management was and what it is now, and I'm going to use a legal term called foreseeable risk. That is a danger which a reasonable person should anticipate as a result of their actions. That's the legal litmus test in the United States. Next. What is your definition? Take a look at all of these definitions. The one I know is not plausible is in the implementation documentation for the ISO 9001:2015, where it says risk is something we avoid automatically. If we did that, this world would be a really great place to live in. Next. The other thing I want to present to you is what's the difference between assumed risk and foreseeable risk. You can, the graph that's up there shows the life cycle of Project Apollo, and the bottom is a typical life cycle of a company. The Apollo 1 fire that killed 3 astronauts was assumed risk because at that point, all of the systems and subsystems had never been tested together. And it was in a pure oxygen environment. There was a braided wire, and it blew them up and burned them up. Next. Later, with the Apollo 13 in-flight explosion, was a foreseeable risk because a technician put the wrong oxygen tanks in the command module, and when they did their cryo stir to stir up the oxygen, it exploded and blew half the service module apart. So you can do assumed risk. You can take the chances personally, and you can take them in a startup business. But nowadays, we have to look for the foreseeable risk in everything we do. Next. The pathology of foreseeable risk. As Mike mentioned, I've trademarked forensic business pathology because I'm going to suggest to you, the auditors, that you start looking at audits as forensic investigations. And what I mean by that is instead of just doing audits, each process is a finite and predictable number of potential variables. We all know that. But humans have the capacity to create, hide, and exacerbate potential defects. Familiarity prevents us from seeing all possible risks within our products and services. Next. So Greg and I are coming at this from a little bit different perspective. One fine morning 20 years ago, a local attorney called me and he said, I have a case here and I think it involves quality control. So I met with him and I looked at the case materials, and it wasn't quality control, it was quality management that was the problem. So when I started the investigation, I did it as if I was doing an audit, except mine was a forensic audit because in this particular case, a family died due to a space heater catching on fire. So as I was doing my expert report, I just held it up and it looked really like an audit report. So 42 cases later, my experiences say that bringing my expert witness work into the quality arena and vice versa, we have a whole new world that we can do. After 3 or 4 cases, I came to the conclusion that the tenets that I learned in quality management over the years were fundamentally flawed, because we're always trying to minimize defects, minimize risk. We really have to avoid it. So that's the thrust of my work for the last few years, is foreseeable risk and risk avoidance. Next. The new paradigm is conventional corporate risk management is conducted because of regulatory requirements and insurance. Customers will use products badly and for unforeseeable reasons. I've got 42 case studies I could share with you where lack of personal judgment is led to these lawsuits. Next. What I'm suggesting to the quality world is that the new paradigm is no avoidable defect ever reaches a customer. Obviously, we have a little bit different viewpoint from the Six Sigma community, but if you plan to have an acceptable defect level, you always will. If you plan to have no defect ever reaches a customer, you can get to the point where you're at an acceptable outgoing quality. So map all the processes and their interrelationships and focus on risk avoidance. Next. Next, Mike. The fundamentals tenets of foreseeable risk are enlightened leadership. I suggest replacing the quality policy with vision, mission, and values that come from the owners of the company. Document processes for training purposes and for evaluating competence. Have personal and group accountability. In other words, what I've put into companies is people are rewarded for their personal accomplishments and how they perform the job, but also each group is accountable to one another. That's been a really, really, really good thing for some of the companies I've worked with. It also, if your company can do it, have personal and group risk and rewards. In other words, if you have no defects, you get a reward. but there has to be consequences for not meeting your goals. Also, another foreseeable risk tenet is the integrated voice of the customer. Make the customer part of your team. Don't just send them a report card to fill out, but have them in your organization to see how it works and how their products, how the products got to where they are. And the last thing, of course, is supplier partnerships. And these days of outsourcing, I've had probably 20 lawsuits where companies in the United States would offshore their product, but they didn't have the same controls that they had over it, and that caused a lot of loss of life. Next, the motivation is avoiding a lawsuit. I'm sure you have different approaches to this in the various countries, but in the United States, there's still a high motivation to sue. I've seen everything from Christmas tree to an oil well head being the subject of a lawsuit. You don't want to go there. It's the company and the personnel will never ever be the same again. Next. So my urging to you is risk avoidance creates the environment where it's cool to play by the rules. Risk avoidance creates cultures where everyone wins. Building toll gates and managing risk ensures humans will devise workarounds. Sustainable success is realized by leading people and managing processes. Back to you, Greg. Back to you, Mike.
Well, thank you, guys. Hopefully you can hear me there. Greg, I think we lost your video, by the way. So if you can turn your video back on, we can see you as well. There you go. Oh, you're dark. Oh, there you are. Great. Thank you, guys. That was really great overview of the risk process, I think, and I think gives us a really good starting point. And hopefully everyone out there who's listening to that can kind of get a flavor and see that we're dealing with two very, very high-level people here who have a lot of experience and certainly understand what risk is all about. So I want to encourage you to get your questions in. If you do have questions, we have a little more than half an hour on the session. So if you have a question, just send them to our panel using the discussion forum box, which is right there on your screen. And then I'm going to relay them on to Greg and Tom. We have a few coming in already, but certainly there's time to get yours in as well. So take advantage of that and send it to us. Before we turn to the questions from the audience, as usual, I like to start with my own question out of my own fertile little brain. So I was wondering at kind of at a basic level, the phrase risk, would you say that that's defined maybe organization by organization? Is it kind of more broad? Is it one size fits all? Is it specific to the context of the organization? Or is it maybe a mix of all or any of those? What do you guys think of that?
Rick?
Tom, do you want to handle that first and I'll pick it up?
Well, let me put my interpretation of that into perspective. When I read the final draft of, 9001-2015, it seemed to me that the technical committee threw a hand grenade over the transom for the quality world, because risk is never really in our lexicon. And what I've seen so far is it's absolutely contextual. Some companies have to have risk management for their insurance or meeting requirements. And then what Greg's presented to you is how to audit risk, and it was a very refreshing approach to it. So the answer to the question is it's contextual. Greg?
Greg?
Okay, I could talk about this probably for days. There's really two outstanding ways to look at risk. One is what we would call the threat-based or event-based, and the other is the objective-based. ISO 9001-2015 basically convoluted or conflated those two approaches, meaning they did this. And when you have two different definitions, or think of it in terms of binormal distribution, and you do this, you basically tend to confuse issues. Risk traditionally is defined as a threat, something that jeopardizes an organization. Is defined in terms of likelihood or probability and consequence or severity. In terms of ISO 9001, risk is really defined as the impediment or the obstacle to being able to meet an objective. That's basically the definition. What type of objective? Specifically, a QMS objective. Now, why is that very critical? If you take what we would call the event-based approach, and I had a client several years ago who had already invested $250,000 in terms of taking a event-based approach, and their risk register had 10,000, probably 20,000 risks that a billion-dollar company was facing. And they'd already invested $250,000, and they called me in to fix this issue. And I basically said, focus on the critical few risks, not the insignificant many that curtail you or impede you from meeting your QMS objectives. That basically changed everything around from trying to boil the ocean with a risk register that had actually 14, 15,000 risks to one that probably had 300 to 400. Again, this is a multi-billion-dollar company, already invested $250,000 in terms of pursuing a registration certification. When you basically recontextualize the definition of risk from a event-based to a objective-based approach, you're going to cut down the number of critical significant risks that impede you, stop you from meeting your objectives. That's the essence of 9001-2015. Forget the threat-based, forget the vulnerability, forget the event-based approach. You're not going to be able to boil an ocean. You're not going to be able to audit that. It's very significant. So the definition, again, of risk is largely contextual. You can define it many, many different ways. We tend to do it 3 different levels: enterprise level, programmatic process, and transactional product.
So you guys are generally in agreement about that it really is more contextual than anything else.
Yeah.
There's no one size fits all.
Mine is very heavily affected by the litigation. That's what I've been doing mostly the last 20 years. And it's just every one of the cases I work on, it was totally avoidable. The risk was foreseeable and avoidable.
I have a question here from one of the attendees who wants to know, the ISO standards mention positive risks. How are positive risk impacts assessed by auditors?
It's yours, Greg.
Sure. So basically, that's an interesting concept. Positive risk essentially is opportunity risk. You define the opportunity in terms of the objective that you want to reach. Let me say that again. You define risk in terms of a positive objective. The risk is really not positive. It's the objective that's positive. Any risks that impede you from meeting or reaching or satisfying that positive objective are the ones that have to be managed and controlled. By the way, controlled to within your risk appetite. We haven't discussed that, but all the discussion of risk really comes down to risk appetite. An organization can have a very large risk appetite or a very narrow one. The more you define your risks in terms of risk appetite, the more types of controls you have.
Mm-hmm. And Tom, how would you respond to that notion of positive risk?
Actually, Greg helped me with that. I haven't done any, excuse me, I haven't done any 9001, 2015 audits in a couple of years, but I really like Greg's definition.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Here's another question. To elevate risk avoidance, where should an organization start that is not ISO minded? So I guess in this case, we're talking about an organization that maybe isn't really involved in ISO standards, 9001, 14001, et cetera, but yet needs to have a sense of risks and mitigating or hopefully avoiding risks.
Well, it starts by incorporating it into the vision, mission, and values of the company. So I've done quite a few 2 and 3 day retreats. We would start with, Mr. Business Owner, tell me what your vision and values are. Then we can create a mission. And I believe we got to get rid of the quality policy and put in vision, mission, and values that are the essence of what the organization stands for. And in almost every case, I don't know what it is, because the owners and the CEOs don't know what it is. They never taken the time to codify what is it that's going to make this company wonderful, great, successful, stay out of litigation. And that's the hardest sell by far, is getting them to internalize what they want out of the company and communicate it and hold everybody accountable for it.
Do ISO standards help with that, or do they, you think, take us further away from that big hairy goal?
Well, as Greg mentioned earlier, it was the first version was very much a compliance document, and the first implementers, all they did was mirror the requirements, the 20 sets of standards that were in there, and they just mirrored it and said, we will do this. And then it was prescriptive, it was overhead. It's still overhead, it's still prescriptive in a lot of them. I go to, well, now it's on video, but our section meetings here, there's still half of the people who are using it to punish somebody. You know, it's, oh man, so we've got to do it because clause 4.1 says you have to do it. No, the reason you do it is because it's the right thing for your company and it has a return on investment.
Boy, yeah. I mean, we have to do it because clause 4.1 says we have to do it. I mean, Deming would be spinning in his grave to hear that, but I'm sure. Here's a question, and I'm curious as to what you're going to say about this one. Was the COVID pandemic considered a foreseeable risk? Why or why not? Oh boy, that's a really interesting one. Greg, what do you think about that?
So a quick story. Starting about a year and a half ago, I started giving talks in Shanghai and Hong Kong, basically articulating the U.S. Perspective of tariffs and why we were going to get into a tariff war. And again, I was giving these talks in the U.S., zooming them over to Shanghai. And I was told by a South China Morning Post, which is the New York Times of Asia for expats, that if I was saying this in China, I would be incarcerated. Basically, we've had, according to the World Health Organization, WHO, about 48 epidemics in the last 5 years. Epidemics, think swine flu, bird flu, all these things are essentially epidemics. Essentially, when it reaches a certain stage, we become a pandemic. The point is, World Health Organization identifies an epidemic every year or every 2 years in different parts of the world. Africa, Asia, India. Yes, essentially answering the question, COVID-19 could be anticipated, something that became a flu, an epidemic, and then essentially a pandemic. It was just simply a matter of time. Was it going to be bird flu? Was it going to be swine flu? Was it going to be, who knows, something that came out of a military weapons lab? We don't know, quite frankly. But yes, it was it could have been anticipated, and as a result, it was not a black swan. I hope I answered that question.
My opinion is it was foreseeable, but if we are always depending on WHO to tell us what our foreseeable risks are. We're going to have the epidemics every few years. So I think it was foreseeable, but we weren't enlightened enough to see it coming.
Well, I mean, maybe I would almost think it'd be both foreseeable and unforeseeable. I mean, the foreseeable part that there would be a pandemic, there would be a global pandemic. I mean, sure, you can see that, but I think what you couldn't foresee was the way that individual people, governments, areas would respond to it. Because, and again, not to get into the weeds or in areas that don't touch on quality, but I mean, there's certainly there's societal, cultural differences that, and this touches on quality because in organizations like this too. I mean, the way that two organizations would deal with the same exact risk could and would be very, very different. The risk itself is probably foreseeable. The way that they would deal with it may be less foreseeable, if that makes sense.
Well, go ahead.
I was going to say, or maybe that's the point of what we're talking about here is to make the unforeseeable more foreseeable. To say, well, if the unforeseeable happens, or if this foreseeable risk happens, we don't want it to be unforeseeable the way that we would deal with it. Whatever it is, we want to have a process in place to deal with it that everybody does do, maybe in the same or similar way.
Yeah, I'm fortunate and unfortunate to have spent my first 14 years at Mission Control, because we lived in an environment that failure is not an option. And Flight Director Krantz told me that several times when I do something not quite right. So coming from that environment, I mean, we had on the flight side of NASA and on the mission control side, our reliability people put together what you said, an ocean, and they worked on it constantly. This can't happen, that can't happen. This has got to be triple redundancy. This has got to be dual redundancy. So I think everything's foreseeable.
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting question. It was a good one. Let's see, we have several coming in here. Here's an interesting one. Is there any such thing as risk-free, or is that just an illusion brought about by the naivete, ignorance, or other kinds of blindnesses? Huh. Interesting. It's almost analogous to the last question, but yeah, what would you say about that, Greg? You got a smile on your face.
Oh, golly. Statistically, there's no such thing as absolute. There's no such thing as risk-free. There's no such thing from auditing as absolute assurance. Doing risk-based audits, and that's one reason why risk-based auditors are getting paid so much, is they have to use their professional best judgment to evaluate really two things. Can your organization meet its objectives? And are the risks, the impediments that stop the organization from meeting its objectives controlled appropriately by culture fit, as well as can it be controlled within the risk appetite of the organization? That's really the issue. So there's really two things going on, probably three things. There's the risk appetite of the auditor. There's the risk appetite of the organization being audited, the auditee. And then there's the risk appetite of the third party to whom the report is going. And the auditor has to basically evaluate all three to make sure that there's a report that has observable findings that offer value. I just said a lot, but there is a lot there. So answering the question, there's no such thing as risk-free, No,
but it depends on what you're manufacturing or what your business is. I worked with a pharmaceutical company here in the area, and in 12 years they had never shipped a wrong order. It was a very good example of self-directed work teams, because the point of that is they didn't ship an order that was wrong, but their parent company didn't manufacture drugs that were wrong. They had to be 100% all the time. So that's what drives me. Is I've seen it done, and I don't recall having seen a pill that I take that isn't what it's supposed to be. So if you're in pharma, you're working towards perfection. It did say risk-free, Greg.
Well, and again, I think it comes down to being contextual. I mean, just to use like Six Sigma as an example, right? I mean, Six Sigma level of performance is probably over embellished for some things. I mean, I think about it, the classic example of air travel. I mean, you never expect a Six Sigma level of performance for your luggage getting there in one piece.
Yeah.
You certainly are going to expect more than a Six Sigma level of performance of you getting there in one piece, right? I mean, so it's really contextual. What's acceptable. Greg, I'm going to go back to you for this one because you mentioned this previously in our little chat here today. What was the process of evaluating your company's risk register to get to the critical few? You mentioned that earlier.
Yeah. So a risk register is a list of all the risks within the organization, not only at corporate, but at each one of the plants. And the idea is you want to focus at the enterprise level, what are the significant risks that we define as material? Material are issues that are reportable in the US on 10Ks and 10Qs. I should be more explicit. 100% of the people that we work with are publicly held companies or large government organizations. If you're publicly held almost anywhere in the world, meaning listed on a stock exchange, you have to have an ERM program, enterprise risk management. That's what's called one of the listing requirements for being on NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. Same way in London. So that organization has to have an ERM program. If they have the ERM program, enterprise risk management, at the enterprise level, they're basically going to break it down into business units, plants, and then individual areas. So what we have is a cascading structure of risks that impede the organization from meeting its objectives. So what that means is you're going to have objectives at the enterprise level, and you want to focus on the critical few objectives that impede you, stop you from meeting that objective. At the next level, business unit, what are the objectives of, what are the critical objectives, mission critical objectives at that level, and what are the risks that stop you from meeting that? In the same way at the plant level, at the functional level, and at the machine level. You want to focus on the critical few, not the many risks that you have, the insignificant many. Did I answer that question, Michael?
I think so, because you're breaking it down to the level that I think is appropriate for this audience, because it's really the level of auditing. I mean, it's the level of how do you confirm, how do you make sure that someone understands those processes and can explain them and can mitigate or can avoid them appropriately within the organization.
Avoid or minimize or manage the risks that impede you, stop you from making those objectives. That's the critical issue.
Mm-hmm.
I learned something.
Please go ahead, Tom.
I was going to say, Tom.
No, I'm next question.
Oh, because I was gonna ask you a little bit more about the avoidance piece of that, and if that is kind of an extension of that. I mean, you talk about minimizing, mitigating, but I mean, quarantining processes that are inherently risky, and avoiding the risk. I mean, that's a paradigm shift. I think that to, in a large measure, is one of the hardest things to wrap your mind around that you're talking about is avoiding, because most people don't. I think even auditors don't understand that avoidance is kind of where it's at. That's really the goal, is to not have the risk maybe at all. I mean, like Greg was saying, there's no risk, but you want to really try to get your processes to the place where those risks are kind of, again, kind of controlled better.
Yep. One of my cases early on was involved a company that manufactured titanium jet engine parts and helicopter blades. And they were buying it in the forging titanium. A very minute amount of silicon metal is used. It's a fraction, just a tiny bit. And for 18 years, they were buying it from a company that made the silicon for cosmetics. And they never did a quality audit. The company said they wouldn't host an audit because you only buy $3,000 worth of product a year. But the titanium company was going through the motions, and they did not inspect it when it came in. They didn't do in-process fluorographic inspection. And it just so happened that the silicon metal plant, a light bulb had burst, and the filament was in the silicon. And it got all the way to the customer before anybody found it.
Wow.
A little fluoroscopic inspection when you forge the titanium would really help.
Yeah, exactly. Here's a question from one of our viewers. In an area that has disasters ongoing in Queensland, Australia, I could probably go for anywhere in the world right now, disasters ongoingly, but it is amazing that most businesses don't have disaster management plans. Government does. To that end, should we be having our clients have a higher understanding, have a higher level of understanding of these? And if so, how do we start that discussion? Well, that's a meaty question right there.
Awareness. How do you teach awareness?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, I mean, but it's a good point. I mean, it's one of those things that buildings do fall down. Unfortunately, we just saw it here in the States. I mean, things happen. I mean, but how do you have that discussion? How do you start it?
Probably by reflecting on disasters that happened before. I'm in a very dry area. We have wildfires are our biggest problem. And there's the news channels are continually warning people about don't shoot guns in dry season, don't have campfires in the dry season. And so the awareness is there, and it's based on catastrophic events that have occurred before. We've evacuated twice in the last 25 years. It got pretty damn close. But we still have people out at shooting ranges back here. We still have people with firecrackers. And unless you're aware and accountable, I don't know the answer to that question.
Accountability. That's a good word we haven't talked about so far. Greg, what about accountability? That's a good one.
It's interesting. Australia was really the early warning, essentially, for what we're seeing right now on the west coast of America. Fires, drought, almost the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which is too bad. Now the question is, how do you get somebody's awareness? To a large extent, they either have religion or they don't. In Australia, almost every city, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, have government requirements for developing an ERM program. So from a fiduciary, from a regulatory point of view, Australia government is very much into understanding the consequences and the likelihood of something happening. From a owner's point of view, or from a homeowner's point of view, it really comes down to risk-based decision making. If we're seeing that on the West Coast, if you can't basically get a loan if you don't have insurance for your house, if your insurance has gone up 3-4 times, not 20-30%, but we're talking 300, 400, 500%, from in US dollars, $2,000 to $10,000, that's going to get your attention. So from a homeowner or from a small, yeah. So the question is, how do you get somebody's attention? It's got to be probably pocketbook or survival. And unfortunately, climate change and the the early warning probably came from Australia and New Zealand for a lot of this, unfortunately. That's a very complicated, that's an easy answer to a complicated question.
Yeah,
How do you?
yeah, these all are, because this is, this is why this is a popular session we're having today, because this is a topic that's difficult and you guys are experts at it. Here's another meaty question that I think demands an interesting answer, hopefully. In the assessment of risk, are you able to assess social, environmental, and business impacts? So how do you bring in social impacts, environmental impacts, business, financial impacts, and I guess health and safety probably as well would be in there.
You are getting meaty questions. That's great.
Yeah. No kidding. I'm glad you guys are answering them.
Start that one off, Greg.
Okay, I'll handle it. To a large extent, again, most of our clients are big companies, large government organizations. They wave their hands for what we would call SEG risks. In the last 6 months, BlackRock, most large US companies now have to define and report and identify materiality and their risks that impede the organization from meeting its objectives. In the US, those are called 10Q reporting requirements. Internationally, what's driving it are the IFRS requirements for financial reporting. They're called SEG requirements. The large accounting firms, PwC, Ernst & Young, KPMG, and Deloitte, they're basically right now looking at SEG reporting requirements in terms of materiality, in terms of those three requirements: social, environment, and government type of risks. And just to give you an example, PwC is basically allocating $12 billion, hiring 100,000 people to basically look at these requirements in the next 5 years. And the billables that we're going to see from that are going to be huge. Now, interestingly, CQI and ASQ looked at those issues 5 years ago. Nobody really cared. Now, when they become reporting issues, financial reporting issues, all of a sudden it's a front page issue for the board. Every government's going to look at it, and every board now is basically addressing that issue. By the way, every publicly held company, publicly listed company, has a risk board group that's looking at those issues. And that's going to be a real big issue, a potentially money issue for consultants for the next 5 to 10 years. All we have to do is, I live in Portland, Oregon, and our weather in the last 3 days have been hitting over 110 for the first time in our history. 110 degrees Fahrenheit, by the way. Did I answer that question, Michael?
I think so. Yes.
Well,
yes.
My experience has been mostly with not privately held companies. So I understand this coming into place, and it really pleases me that they're doing that, because I was part of an organization called Financials, I've forgotten what it's called, but my job was to write FS 9001. I had all of the companies you mentioned were in our group. Deutsche Bank, the guy that headed it up was the quality manager for Citibank. And we had the standard written, and we were 2 weeks before 9/11, we were in the World Trade Center pitching it to those companies to get them on board, to look at proactive instead of reactive. And it took a while for them to get the concept, but it sounds like in the 20 years since we did that somebody got the message. The problem with private companies is there's no awareness. Every case I've worked on where there's a private company, they were totally oblivious to what they did to cause an accident. I mentioned the space heater company at the very beginning. They just make little space heaters, and the judge of the case let me do an audit at the plant because everything they were telling me sounded like sounded like they didn't know what they were doing. And the thing I always remember is they have a burn-in room for all their products, and every one of them had scorched concrete underneath it. Doesn't that tell you something?
Exactly. Exactly. Well, gentlemen, that was a great session. I want to say you guys are really excellent, presenters. I want to thank you all for being there. Thanks to all of you for some great questions. Really, really good, thought-provoking questions. Made us burn our brains, especially these two guys. Tom Taormina, Greg Hutchins. Thank you guys for the benefits of your wisdom as regards risk and auditing. I think that was a great session. So, thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.
Of course,
Thank you.
my pleasure.
Great job,
And
Mike.
to all
See
of
you.
you guys out there, before we go, you can purchase your CPD certificate right there on your screen. So please do so if you've attended the session. And thank you all for being here. We'll see you next time here on the Online Auditor Expo.